If it's possible with your connection to put your video on, that would be great. We know it helps with us to stay engaged with each other, but if that's not possible, we of course understand. There's simultaneous interpretation in English, French, and Portuguese. Speakers will be using different languages throughout the session, so please make sure at the bottom of your screen to select the language you prefer so you're hearing in the correct channel. And please feel free to write questions in the chat in any of the 3 languages, or to, when you ask a question or speak out loud, to use whatever language is most comfortable to you. We'll record this session in all 3 languages, and we'll make the recordings available to you afterwards. And then finally, we just ask, if your name is not already listed in your Zoom, to please change your name so we know how to refer to you. And then feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Thank you so much for joining the session today. To open today's event, we'll first hear a few welcome remarks from both of the KICS hubs. We'll start with UNESCO International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa Director, Dr. Yumiko Yokozeki, on behalf of the KICS Africa 19 hub. So please let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Sorry that I am not in the office, so it's a bit, I'm struggling a little bit. I hope you can hear me all right. So anyway, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm welcoming you all. Actually, I feel like I'm being welcomed. Members from ministries of education and civil society organizations throughout Africa. Larry Cooley, a senior advisor at the Brookings Institution. Brad Olsen, as senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Organizers from the Brookings Institution and the Jacobs Foundation. Members of the Global Partnership for Education's KICS Africa Hub 19 and 21. And all other speakers and participants. Good afternoon to all of you. It is really an honor and pleasure to witness this special and diverse gathering of ministry officials, policymakers, and the thought leaders from across the continent. Both KICS Africa 19 and 20 countries from the East, the West, and the South. This is one of the first events we have organized with our sister hub, the KICS Africa 21 hub in Francophone Africa, and it will not be the last. You have come to this meeting because you are interested in KICS. KICS stands for K for knowledge, and innovation for I, and exchange for X. The letter K-I-X. I think it's a very pop naming. You are here today because you are interested in the exchange of knowledge and innovation between change makers like yourselves across national borders. You are here to learn about Côte d'Ivoire's experience in the scaling of programs to improve learning outcomes for Ivorian children. It is my hope that the Côte d'Ivoire's experience inspires you with the idea and lessons you can take to your own governments and countries. The Global Partnership for Education's KICS Hub project to promote learning, dialogue, and research about what works in teaching, learning, and education governance in 39 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Since 2020, in the early days of COVID-19 pandemic, the KICS Hub project has been a dynamic platform for the exchange of African innovations in how to mitigate learning loss from COVID, how to strive for gender equity in education, and how to address the data challenge in education, and how to strengthen basic education and early childhood education, and several other important areas. We are at the UNESCO ICBA, International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa, short acronym is ICBA. We are at UNESCO ICBA partner with African Union and UNICEF SARO to support 18 countries in Africa in their education development through knowledge and innovation exchange, such as through this workshop today. We work in solidarity with our sister hub, KICS Africa 21. Now, this partnership and these dialogues are our gateway to creating African solutions to African challenges and issues using African knowledge and experience. How to scale innovations effectively, equitably, and sustainably remains our top priority and challenge for governments around the world, not only in Africa alone. When good programs are scaled up, they can meet the learning needs of more children. It is most important to innovate for and bring innovation to the learners who society leave behind. Girls, especially young mothers, socially and economically disadvantaged students, and the students with disabilities, for example. I thank all the participants who have accepted the challenges of scaling, and wish you all a very fruitful deliberation today and the next two meetings to come. So thank you very much for giving me opportunity to meet you all. Thank you very much, and very good. I wish you a very good meeting.
Thank you so much. Now we'll hear from the director of the Francophone Institute for Education and Training to provide some welcome remarks on behalf of the Africa 21 Hub.
Bonjour, merci. Merci de m'avoir donné la parole. Bonjour tout le monde. C'est toujours un plaisir de vous retrouver, même par écran interposé. Donc, Madame la directrice de l'ICBA, vous êtes à côté de nous à Ghana, mais vous pouvez faire un petit saut pour venir à l'IFEF. On sera heureux de vous accueillir. Chers collègues de Brookings et de Jacob Foundation, Mesdames et Messieurs, tout d'abord, je voudrais vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette première séance de la série de formations sur la problématique de la mise à l'échelle des innovations, une formation à l'endroit de nos équipes de coordination nationale des centres KICS 19 et 21, et je salue fortement cette collaboration entre les deux KICS. Madame la directrice a expliqué c'est quoi le KICS, et les lettres de KICS sont très jolies à prononcer ensemble, donc je ne reviendrai pas là-dessus. Afin de poursuivre mes propos, je voudrais saluer l'excellente collaboration avec le Brookings Institute, Jacobs Foundation et Hub Africa 19, qui est basé à l'UNESCO ICBA. En effet, dans le cadre du mécanisme KICS, il est fortement recommandé par le Partenariat mondial pour l'éducation, le CRDI, de collaborer non seulement avec les différents centres KICS partenaires, mais également avec les différents programmes bénéficiaires des subventions qui constituent le mécanisme KICS pour une cohérence d'action envers nos pays partenaires du PMI. Brookings Institute et le programme TREC ont une grande expérience à partager avec nos équipes de coordination nationale, ceci afin de renforcer leurs capacités sur la façon dont nous pouvons capitaliser sur les innovations qui sont porteuses de changements qualitatifs dans l'éducation de manière durable et à l'échelle. Vous conviendrez avec moi qu'il s'agit sans doute d'un événement majeur, car cette problématique est au cœur du processus que nous avons entamé avec nos pays et constitue un élément fondamental dans la réflexion pour aller vers des systèmes éducatifs pertinents, équitables et de qualité. Mesdames et messieurs, le centre KICS Afrique 21, vous l'avez compris, c'est 21, donc 21 pays partenaires de la francophonie lusophone, d'où l'usage du portugais aujourd'hui, de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, de l'Afrique centrale et de l'océan Indien. Il est composé d'un consortium coordonné par l'Organisation internationale de la francophonie à travers l'Institut de la francophonie pour l'éducation et la formation, l'institut que je dirige. Ce consortium est respectivement composé de deux autres acteurs incontournables de la francophonie, notamment la conférence des ministres des États et gouvernements de la francophonie et de l'Agence universitaire de la francophonie, AUE. Le partenariat entre ces différentes institutions témoigne d'un fort intérêt commun à relever le défi d'éducation dans les pays en développement partenaires et du PME en espace francophone. Le centre travaille sur 3 axes fondamentaux qui sont la mobilisation des connaissances, la production des connaissances et le renforcement des compétences des acteurs des systèmes éducatifs dans nos pays et au-delà. La production de données probantes, et on attend que les données probantes, et le partage des innovations et des connaissances constituent les éléments clés pour progresser vers les objectifs du développement durable et de l'éducation 2030. Récemment, la pandémie de la Covid nous a donné l'opportunité, disons, mais nous a donné l'occasion surtout de réinventer nos systèmes éducatifs et de repenser nos approches pédagogiques et nos apprentissages. Il y a certainement des leçons et des enseignements à tirer de cette période de Covid. Et dans cette perspective, certaines innovations ont vu le jour. Et puis, c'est toujours le besoin qui mobilise les innovations. Donc, il y a certainement des innovations qui ont été faites. Donc, ces innovations, on va les retrouver pour les partager avec vous et pour travailler sur cette façon de comment amplifier ces innovations. Donc, je pense que je ne vais pas trop tarder. Donc, avant de terminer mes propos, je voudrais adresser mes chaleureux remerciements à tous nos partenaires, que ce soit l'AUF, que ce soit la Confemen pour l'excellente collaboration. Je voudrais également remercier nos pays partenaires qui sont ici présents avec nous pour leur disponibilité, pour leur contribution de qualité. Et je vous remercie et je vous souhaite des bonnes sessions de formation.
Thank you so much. Let me now give the floor to Brad Olson, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, who will let us remind us of the aims of today and kick off our discussion.
Hello, everybody. It's wonderful that we're all here today. My name is Brad Olson. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and I work in the Center for Universal Education, or the CUE, and I'm also leading a multi-year KICS initiative called ROSI, which stands for Research on Scaling the Impact of Innovations in Education. And I'm delighted to be here today, and I just thought that building on some of the remarks that we've just heard, I will go ahead and introduce this 3-part learning series. This 3-part learning series is hosted by the Africa 19 and Africa 21 KICS hubs, and we're very grateful for their support. This is also supported by and hosted by the Jacobs Foundation, for whom we're very grateful. The 3-part series is called Scaling Impact in Education Through Institutionalization and Innovative Partnerships, a case study from Côte d'Ivoire. That's a mouthful, so let me unpack it just a little bit. The overarching theme of the 3 workshops is institutionalization. That's the word that we use to describe the process by which an initiative or components of an initiative become embedded inside or within the formal education system and are adopted and supported by government actors. Institutionalization is one scaling pathway. And so all 3 sessions, the one today, the one next Wednesday, and the one the Wednesday after that, will examine institutionalization as one dimension of scaling, and will do so through the lens of the Côte d'Ivoire case study. Today's session will take a broader look at scaling as institutionalization. Next week's will look more specifically at multi-stakeholder partnerships as an important component of identifying, adapting, and scaling education initiatives, as well as mobilizing new funding. And then the 3rd session, which will be on June 15th, will offer a focus on data and continuous learning, specifically ways in which using data in a continuous real-time fashion can support evidence-based decision-making and scaling. The purpose of this learning series is to bring together education decision makers from across the Africa 19 and Africa 21 member countries. The idea here is that you all have a wealth of knowledge, and you have already thought through a lot of these things and have engaged in the work of identifying, adopting, adapting, and supporting education innovations at scale. And so we want to create a space where everyone can learn from and talk with each other. The focus for that work is the case study in Côte d'Ivoire, but the point is that we can all learn by talking from and thinking about the work of each other and how that might be applied to the work that each of us is doing. Specifically, we'll focus on how to track institutionalization, how to leverage innovative partnerships, how to continuously gather and use data to inform the process of embedding and institutionalizing a promising innovation. To that end, there's an institutionalization tracker that we at the CUE have developed and that we would like to use at different points during the course of these 3 sessions. I want to talk a little bit about the featured speakers and the case study itself. The Jacobs Foundation is one important organization. They invest in the future of young people so that young people become socially responsible and productive members of society. In 2015, the Jacobs Foundation conceived Transforming Education in Cocoa Communities, or TREC, T-R-E-C-C, as a program to of children and young people in Côte d'Ivoire through quality education. Over the past 5 years, this coalition has brought together the Ivorian government, 17 cocoa and chocolate companies, 20 civil service organizations and academic partners, and 3 foundations. This coalition is really important to the success of the work, and I think it's going to get a lot of attention over these next 3 learning sessions. Since 2014, the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution has been trying to address the challenges of scaling in education through its Millions Learning Project. The Millions Learning Project focuses on how and under what conditions quality education initiatives scale. In 2018, the CUE launched its real-time scaling labs. This is an action research project undertaken in partnership with local institutions and governments in several countries to support, learn from, and document the scaling process in real time. Over the last 3 years, the Jacobs Foundation and CUE have worked together to implement a scaling lab in Côte d'Ivoire. It was launched in 2019 in collaboration with TREC and the Ministry of National Education and Literacy. And this lab centers on the government-led process of implementing, adapting, and scaling the Programme d'Enseignement Ciblé. I don't think I'm pronouncing that very well. We call it the PEC or the PEC, which is a remedial education approach to improving early grade reading and math, adapted from the teaching at the right level methodology that's well known throughout Africa. While the lab focused on the experience of PEC to date, it also serves as a case study. And so today and for the next 3 sessions, we will hear from representatives from the Ministry of National Education and Literacy in Côte d'Ivoire, Teaching at the Right Level Africa, Innovations for Poverty Action, representatives from TREC, private sector partners, and also some of the CUE individuals who have learned from this case study. In a way, what we hope to do is engage in conversation to talk about moving away from project mindsets and what it means to implement a project versus the notion of institutionalizing the initiative so that it stays over time, so that it gets picked up by the government, so that the government and civil service and other representatives can work together to build a coalition of stakeholders to ensure that promising education initiatives can remain in use in African countries to improve education across the continent. We're very excited for this event, and we hope you all enjoy it very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brad. So before we dive into the case study in greater depth, we're first going to hear a presentation from Larry Cooley, who's a Senior Advisor and President Emeritus of Management Systems International, as well as a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, who's going to talk about the issue of scaling more generally, an overview of its key principles, and why it is so challenging, particularly in the case of institutionalization, but more broadly as well. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Larry.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet you all. And it's a pleasure to talk to you about what's one of my favorite subjects, which is how good things go to scale. It may seem to you, I'm not sure, but perhaps it seems to you like this is a simple concept. And I think at the most basic level it is. But as I've learned working on it for the last 22 years, the deeper you go, the more complicated and the more interesting it becomes. So I'm going to try to share a few of those high points with you today, just by way of orienting the discussion. Let me begin with a picture. Picture in front of you probably looks like an obvious thing to you. I suspect that some of you look at this and you see a candle burning. And some of you may look at this and you see two faces looking towards each other. And now that I've told you that, you can probably see both, but your eye wants to see one and not the other. That's the way it is with scaling. Let me show you another picture to make my point. Take a look at this one. And I think for most of you, what your brain does is it focuses on those blue bars on the left side of the picture. Probably you're thinking that's progress or different interventions or different groups making movement across a field of objectives. But some of you probably look at the white space to the right. That's the need, which is not yet being met. That's where the blue bars have not yet moved. That's what I'll call for this purpose, the scaling mindset. And let me take that a bit further on the next slide. So that scaling mindset comes naturally to businesses, particularly growth-oriented businesses, and to governments. Businesses, they think about what they call the addressable market. Who can I sell my product to? And so they're concerned about the whole population. And they're thinking about not a market for today, but a market for as long as possible. So they're thinking about sustainability. Governments, they're thinking about who's within the population needs this service or this good. And they're thinking again over time. But now come to the next slide and think about a different situation. This is a situation where we introduce the project mentality and we introduce external donors. All of a sudden, it gets much more complicated. There's relationships between the donors and the government. There's relationships between the donor and the implementing partner. And sometimes this focus on the full scale, on the full need, and on the long term gets lost to what Brad and I'm calling the project mentality on this. We look at 1, 3, or 5 years. We look at particular beneficiaries. We look at direct outcomes and not indirect outcomes. We look at the project as an accomplishment instead of simply changing the new normal. So we want to suggest that the scaling mentality is that more simple notion that says there's a need, and how are we going to meet the need, and how are we going to use the project or the intervention to help meet that need. Next slide. So let's think a little bit about how something that starts small gets to big. Everything starts with somebody, either an individual or usually an organization. And many of the innovations in education may begin in an NGO or perhaps in one school or in one part of the ministry. We call the organization or the unit that begins the innovation, we call that the originating organization, the organization that started the change, that invented the change, if you want to think about it that way. So when something goes to scale, there are basically 3 broad pathways. The first we call expansion. And that means for us that the organization that started the activity grows to bring it to more and more people in more and more places. If you want a mental model for this, think about McDonald's. Begins with one hamburger stand in one place, and at some point, there are McDonald's everywhere serving millions and millions and millions of people. That's expansion. That happens very rarely in education. It's very rare that an NGO starts something and then the NGO grows to deliver to more and more people. But there are examples. Think about BRAC in Bangladesh as one good example. Replication is much more common. What's replication? In this case, the originating organization, the people who begin the innovation, transfer control over to someone else. Perhaps it begins in an NGO and then it moves into the government. That's what most of the institutionalization looks like. That's what you'll be talking largely about for the next 3 sessions. But there's a third situation. The third pathway we call collaboration. In collaboration, the originating organization hands over to someone else, but continues to be involved as well. Perhaps it continues to train the trainers, or it continues to do development of curriculum, or it continues providing quality control or monitoring and evaluation. More and more, we're seeing these examples of collaboration, multi-party scaling exercises all around the globe, and most particularly in the education sector. Next. So think about it this way. Projects are important, but projects are not the objective. Changing the world is the objective. Reaching all the children who need help with whatever intervention we're trying to reach them with, that's the objective. So we have the project, but there was a world before the project. There's a world after the project. The project is a short-term intervention designed to alter long-term processes or outcomes. So what can we do in 1, 3, or 5 years with a certain amount of resources in order to make the world after different than the world before, to reach the full need and not just the project beneficiaries? Here's another way to think about it. If you think about change, most changes begin slowly. In fact, almost all of them begin slowly. And we have many examples of things going on in education that improve things little by little. That's the way most change happens. But as several scholars at the Brookings Institution have proven, if we wanted to close the gap in education by just continuing at the current slow rate, it would be more than 100 years before we close that gap. So our hope when we're scaling is that we can think of something, some way to intervene, to use a project or an intervention to make that change go faster, to have those outcomes suddenly go vertical. That's what we call the S curve. So it goes along slowly, but then we hope there's something we can do to help make that go vertical. That's what people who intervene in situations are hoping for. They're looking for something we can do now that will change that trajectory, that will accelerate that curve. Next. So part of that often has to do with pilot or demonstration projects. Someone develops something that they think can make a major difference for lots of people. They test it, and then often we hope that that will simply scale up if it proves to be effective. One of the things we at Brookings and others have learned over time is that that automatic scaling of good ideas almost never happens. If scaling is going to happen, it's because people do it very deliberately and very purposefully. And part of that is changing our mindset about how we approach pilot or demonstration projects. Yes, we need proof of concept, but that's not enough. And the other things we need are listed here on the slide. We need to use that pilot stage to test how simple we can make the intervention, how much we can make it practical for implementation throughout the whole system. It's what we call second stage pilots. So for example, it worked here, but will it work there? It worked with the NGO, will it work with the government system? It worked at this cost level, will it work at that cost level? Those are what we call second stage pilots, and we can use pilots to test things, but that's much more than just proof of concept. Another thing we can use pilots to do is to say, can the eventual implementers, usually the Ministry of Education, implement this? So instead of continuing to do it through NGOs, how do we gradually move that responsibility over to the people who will be doing it forever, we hope? So how do we get much more involvement by and embeddedness within large-scale implementers? Again, we can do that during the pilot stage, not wait until later. Third, focus on cost. Don't wait until the effect is proven. Try to cut the cost as much as you can, as quickly as you can, without undermining the effectiveness. Again, things we can test during the pilot stage. Fourth use of pilots is identifying and building a plan for how that transition to scale will happen, even before we know if it deserves to be scaled. Because if you wait until you're sure, you haven't laid the foundations for scale. And finally, during the pilot stage, try to figure out where the weakest links are, where the challenge is going to be, and come up with ideas and plans and strategies for trying to deal with those. That's a very much larger notion of pilot project than the more typical one that focuses almost exclusively on proof of concept. Next. Some of you are very much involved in the scaling process, and different people have used different strategies. We've tried to pull that together into a scaling framework that looks at scaling as 10 tasks that can be managed systematically. For those of you who want to know more, we have quite a lot written about this. But all I'll say right now is that the first set of tasks, what we call step one, you can see as the acorn, the little seed, and that has to do with planning. And what we believe is that if you're serious about scaling, you plan with scale in mind. So tasks 1, 2, 3, and 4 all have to do with how you plan if you're thinking about scaling from the beginning. Step 2, tasks 5, 6, and 7 all have to do with laying the foundations, the roots for scaling. And that has to do with gaining the necessary credibility, building the constituencies, mobilizing the financial and technical resources. I can tell you now with many years of experience, this step is the one that usually gets too little attention. People think they can go straight from step 1 to step 3, from planning to implementation, but there's a step in the middle that has to do with the roots. Step 3, which is what we normally think of as scaling, is making organizational changes, coordinating actions, setting up monitoring and evaluation systems as we move to larger and larger numbers. I'll say just a little bit more about this as we go along. So here's a key element in this, and this was something I did not understand when I started working on scaling, but I understand it now very clearly. Think about scaling as having 3 gears. On the left is the small gear, innovation, generating new and better ideas of how to do things. I want to suggest to you that that gear is turning pretty well these days. We have lots of experimentation going on. We have prizes, people build reputations and do publications about innovations. On the right-hand side, we have delivery at scale. That too is going quite well. After the Millennium Development Goals, we now have lots of people in school. We have lots of teachers and schools and materials delivering education, perhaps not the way we wish, but delivering services to large numbers of people. The piece that's missing, what I would call the broken part of the innovation value chain, is that gear in the middle that we're calling intermediation, which is how do those innovations find their way into the large system? That's what you're calling institutionalization right now. How does it move from being just a separate innovation to becoming a regular part of the system, what some people would call the new normal? What kind of functions are involved in that intermediation? Next slide. There are things like this, helping to strengthen the systems, raising the necessary funds, packaging the investment, advocacy, convening, change management. All of these things have to be done by someone. And often the people who do the innovation don't do this, and the people who run the full system don't do this. So this becomes the broken or the slow part of the business cycle. And so those of you and the KICS network, you have critical roles to play in this. As far as I'm concerned, you're right in this area of intermediation. If you stay all the way over on the innovation side, you won't be doing that job fully. But if you see it as your job, not just to study the innovation, but to help it move across, then you're moving into that area that we're calling intermediation. Next. So summarizing all of what I've said so far, these are what I would suggest to you are the 6 key planning questions to have in your mind. Exactly what are we scaling? We're probably not scaling the project. We're scaling something that was being tested in the project. What's the pathway to scale? Is it expansion? Is it replication? Is it collaboration? And how are we going to do that? Who will be implementing at scale? Who will be the doer at scale? Who will be funding at scale? Who's responsible for the scaling? That's what I'm calling the intermediation. And is there something that we could do that could cause the rate of change to go from incremental to exponential? That's that J curve that I showed you a few minutes ago. Okay, let me just end this with 5 key scaling principles that I think summarize a lot of what I've said. First, you need to fall in love with the problem before you embrace the solution. By that, I mean, before you become in such a hurry to scale up an intervention, make sure you stay clear on what the problem is that you're trying to solve and whether this intervention is really the best way to solve it. It's what some people call the 5 whys. Somebody says, I'm doing this, I say, why? They say, well, because of this. And I say, well, why is that? And then they say, well, that's because of this. And I say, why is that? By the time you get to the 5th why, usually you're somewhere near the root causes of the root problem. So that's my best practical guidance on how to get to the bottom of the problem before you go too quickly to scale the solution. Second, think subtraction, not addition. This is a little bit counterintuitive because when we're trying to solve a problem, we're usually trying to come up with the best solution. But I want you to think also about the most replicable, the most sustainable, the most scalable solution. And for that, simplicity is our friend. So even while you're building a solution, try to ask yourself, could I do it simpler? Could I do it cheaper? Could I do it easier? And begin testing that as early as possible. Third, context as both king and queen in this situation. In other words, it almost never is true that something that worked in one situation can be simply transferred and dropped into another situation. You need to understand a lot about the environment that you're working in, what the drivers are, what the constraints are, what the system dynamics are. This is not a reason not to scale. This is a way to scale. Fourth, scale and sustainability are twins. They're not the same thing, they're twins, and they never should have been separated, but they have often been separated. Scale means at what magnitude and to how many. Sustainability means, will it be there tomorrow? Governments have the requirement, the obligation, and the mindset to think about both at the same time. But sometimes donor agencies focus on one or the other. Originally, we were focused more on sustainability, and we often forgot about scale. These days, sometimes we focus on scale and we forget about sustainability. And finally, there's the pathway to scale. My own experience has been when things scale successfully, it's usually about a 15-year process. It's not fast, but there are many turning points along the way. So the idea that you simply have a plan and then you roll out the plan over time, I think is the wrong way to think about scale. It's rather a series of, first there's a pilot, then you're testing it, then you're making refinements and going further, then you're testing that, then you're continuing to scale and you're testing as you go. Adaptive management is central to scaling, and it's the only way to reach a scaling destination with confidence. Thank you very much, and I hope this is helpful as you think about the Côte d'Ivoire case, which, by the way, is a fascinating case. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Larry. I promise everyone we will have time to ask Larry questions in just a few moments. So if you've had questions come up during his presentation, write them down. We'll absolutely get to them. But first, we will hear a few more details on the case he was talking about that we'll be focusing on for these next 3 sessions as a way to have a real concrete example for these themes and issues we're discussing. So next, I will turn it over to Teaching at the Right Level Africa, who will share details on the case of PEC in Côte d'Ivoire. And then after their presentation, we'll have a question and answer session with both Tarl Africa and Larry. So please do start thinking about questions that you have for them. Over to you, Tarl Africa.
Parfait. Bonjour à tous. Est-ce qu'on m'entend bien? Parfait. Donc, je suis Marion Paravicini, la coordinatrice des programmes pour Tarl Africa. Je vais faire cette présentation et je suis accompagnée donc de Madeleine Adaye, qui est la coordinatrice des programmes pour le PEC en Côte d'Ivoire et qui pourra également répondre à vos questions durant la session de questions-réponses. Parfait. Donc, on peut passer au premier slide. Donc, aujourd'hui, ce que je vais faire, c'est que je vais vous parler du programme d'enseignement ciblé. Mais avant ça, je vais vous parler de l'approche TARL. Le programme d'enseignement ciblé est une adaptation donc, de cette approche au contexte ivoirien. Ensuite, je vais vous parler très rapidement donc, de l'organisation qui appuie techniquement le ministère en Côte d'Ivoire, qui est Tarl Africa. Donc, c'est important de faire la différence. On a l'approche TARL et l'organisation Tarl Africa. Et ensuite, on pourra aller donc dans le détail de cette adaptation qui est le programme d'enseignement ciblé. On peut passer au prochain slide. Prochain slide. Merci. Donc, avant de vous parler donc, de l'approche TARL, Teaching at the Right Level, il faut que je vous parle donc de la racine du problème. Comment est-ce qu'on en est arrivé au développement de cette approche? Donc, ce qui s'est passé, c'est qu'au fil des années, on s'est rendu compte que dans beaucoup de pays, il y a eu d'énormes progrès en termes de scolarisation des enfants. C'est-à-dire que de plus en plus d'enfants étaient inscrits à l'école, ce qui est une belle progression en soi. Cependant, on s'est également rendu compte que l'inscription des enfants à l'école ne garantissait pas leur instruction. C'est-à-dire qu'on a des enfants qui sont inscrits à l'école, mais qui, à la sortie du primaire, n'ont pas acquis les compétences de base. Et c'est face à ce constat que l'ONG Pratam a développé l'approche TARL qui vient cibler les racines de la crise de l'apprentissage. L'idée, c'est de déplacer l'attention des systèmes éducatifs de la scolarisation pour tous vers l'apprentissage pour tous. Depuis le développement de cette approche, il y a eu plusieurs versions qui ont été évaluées, donc qui ont fait l'objet d'évaluations randomisées, des évaluations menées par l'organisation JEPAL en Inde. Et plus donc, cette approche a été développée en Inde, elle a commencé à également être développée en Afrique. Donc, il y a également eu des recherches qui ont montré que lorsque l'approche TARL est mise en œuvre avec succès, les résultats d'apprentissage s'améliorent. Donc, je vais donc vous parler de ce qu'on entend par de la scolarisation pour tous vers l'apprentissage pour tous. On peut passer au prochain slide, s'il vous plaît. Parfait. Donc, l'objectif aujourd'hui d'aller de l'école pour tous vers l'apprentissage pour tous, je vais vous l'expliquer à travers ce qu'on voit dans les systèmes habituels et qu'est-ce que l'approche Teaching at the Right Level propose. Tout d'abord, donc, on va voir au niveau de l'enseignant ou au niveau du système, on se rend compte que l'objectif dans beaucoup de systèmes éducatifs, c'est d'achever le programme scolaire. L'enseignant est focalisé sur le programme. Or, Teaching at the Right Level va prôner de garantir à tous les enfants les compétences fondamentales de base en mathématiques et en lecture. Donc, l'idée, c'est vraiment de déplacer le problème vers les enfants. Ensuite, au niveau de la formation et du suivi, on se rend compte que dans beaucoup de systèmes éducatifs, encore une fois, il y a très peu de suivi des enseignants après les formations initiales. Or, l'idée pour TARL, c'est justement de former les enseignants et de leur fournir un suivi et un encadrement grâce au mentorat de proximité. Donc, on a donc un système de mentorat de proximité qui va se faire avec les personnes donc, en charge de la supervision qui existent déjà. Ça peut être des conseillers pédagogiques, ça peut être des inspecteurs pédagogiques qui vont s'assurer de ce suivi. Ensuite, au niveau du regroupement des élèves, dans la majorité des systèmes, si ce n'est dans tous les systèmes, les enfants sont regroupés par classe. Or, on va se rendre compte qu'on a des classes qui sont parfois très hétérogènes. On a des enfants qui ont des niveaux débutants et des enfants qui ont des niveaux avancés qui sont ensemble et qui ont un programme, qui ont le même programme. Au niveau de l'approche d'Arles, ce qu'on va faire, c'est qu'on va faire en sorte que les enfants soient regroupés selon leur niveau réel et pendant un certain temps. Donc, ça ne va pas être forcément pendant toute la journée, mais pendant un certain temps. Et au fur et à mesure qu'ils progressent, ils passent au groupe de niveau supérieur. Un enfant qui est débutant lettres, qu'il soit au CE1 ou au CM2, vont être dans le même groupe et au fur et à mesure, ils vont progresser dans les groupes suivants, c'est-à-dire mots, paragraphes ou encore histoire. Ensuite, donc, ce qui est important aussi, c'est la conduite des activités et la gestion de la classe. Donc, en soi, aujourd'hui, ce qu'on voit dans beaucoup de systèmes, c'est un enseignement qui est d'une part axé sur le système scolaire, mais d'autre part, on va assister à un cours magistral, c'est-à-dire qu'on a l'enseignant qui parle et les enfants qui écoutent. Or, aujourd'hui, il est important aussi que les enfants puissent prendre part au cours. Donc, non seulement les activités vont être adaptées au niveau des enfants au fur et à mesure de leur progression, elles vont se faire en grands groupes, mais également en petits groupes et individuellement pour donner la possibilité à l'enfant de prendre part à l'activité. L'enseignant également va toujours se mettre au niveau des enfants, c'est-à-dire que si les enfants sont assis par terre, l'enseignant s'assoit par terre. Selon la disposition de la classe, l'enseignant doit s'assurer d'être proche des enfants. Une dernière étape qui est importante, c'est l'évaluation et le suivi. Dans la plupart des classes, on va avoir une évaluation papier-stylo. Donc, l'évaluation peut être au tableau ou sur papier. Et l'enfant est assis seul avec son stylo. Et généralement, c'est des évaluations qui sont faites soit en début et en fin d'année scolaire. Donc, on n'a pas forcément la possibilité au cours de l'année de voir quelle est la progression et de remédier aux problèmes qu'on pourrait éventuellement observer. Ensuite, au niveau de TARL Africa, au niveau de l'approche TARL plutôt, excusez-moi, on va aller vers une évaluation orale simple qui va être périodique et individuelle, aussi très rapide parce qu'il faut faire en sorte que l'enseignant puisse évaluer tous les élèves et elle va se faire donc en début, en milieu et en fin d'année. Ça va permettre à l'enseignant de pouvoir, en cours d'année, de savoir si les enfants ont progressé, s'ils n'ont pas progressé, d'essayer de comprendre pourquoi et de trouver les solutions adéquates pour faire progresser les enfants jusqu'à la fin de l'année scolaire. Voilà, donc on peut également voir comment cela se traduit dans la salle de classe. Prochain slide, merci. Donc voilà, dans la classe, elle va se traduire à travers un processus qui est très simple et qui va impliquer des éléments clés. C'est-à-dire que dans la première partie, on va avoir une évaluation simple, donc individuelle, et qui va permettre de regrouper les enfants qui sont dans des classes différentes, donc CE1, CE2, CM1 et CM2 dans le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire, par niveau plutôt que par classe. Vous pouvez voir sur la photo qu'on a un enseignant qui est proche de l'élève, qui est à l'aise avec l'élève. L'élève est dans une situation où il n'est pas seul face à son évaluation, mais il a vraiment l'accompagnement de l'enseignant qui le rassure. Ensuite, on va avoir donc des activités et des outils qui sont adaptés au niveau de chaque groupe. Donc ça, c'est la deuxième étape. C'est-à-dire que selon le niveau des enfants, les activités sont adaptées. Ensuite, une étape importante, c'est aussi le regroupement dans la classe. Encore une fois, on n'est pas dans un cours magistral, mais on va faire en sorte que les activités de grands groupes puissent permettre à l'enseignant d'expliquer aux enfants comment l'activité va se dérouler. Et ensuite, l'idée des petits groupes, c'est de faire en sorte que les enfants puissent apprendre entre pairs, donc participer, être plus à l'aise qu'en grand groupe. Et ensuite, l'étape du travail individuel vient également. L'enfant doit être aussi capable de faire du travail de façon individuelle. Ensuite, ce qui se passe, c'est que les enfants vont progresser. Donc, l'enfant ne reste pas dans le même groupe. Je vois que quelqu'un dit que c'est inaudible. Est-ce que vous m'entendez mieux?
We can hear you.
OK, parfait. Donc, ensuite, donc, les enfants ne vont pas rester dans le même groupe. Donc, tout au long de l'année, l'enfant il va progresser d'un groupe à l'autre. Ça peut être soit selon le jugement de l'enseignant, soit après les évaluations. Donc, voilà. Et encore une fois, donc, ces évaluations telles qu'elles sont faites au début de l'année vont être faites en milieu et en fin d'année. Ça va également permettre à l'enseignant de suivre la progression des enfants et de réorganiser les groupes en fonction de la progression de chaque enfant. Voilà. Prochain slide, s'il vous plaît. Donc, très rapidement, avant de passer donc, à la présentation du... Ouais. Donc, très rapidement, avant de passer à la présentation du PEC en Côte d'Ivoire, je vais vous parler de l'organisation qui met en œuvre, qui ne met pas en œuvre, qui appuie techniquement le ministère de l'Éducation en Côte d'Ivoire à la mise en œuvre du PEC et aussi dans d'autres pays. Donc, c'est TARL Africa, à ne pas confondre encore une fois avec l'approche TARL. TARL Africa est l'organisation qui appuie techniquement donc, les gouvernements ou les organisations à mettre en œuvre le PEC. L'histoire en Afrique, parce que l'approche, elle est développée en Inde, mais en Afrique, l'histoire commence en 2015 où l'organisation Pratam et l'organisation JEPAL commencent à travailler avec le ministère de l'Éducation en Zambie pour adapter l'approche et l'étendre à l'échelle. Ensuite, en 2017, c'est en Côte d'Ivoire que l'histoire continue avec le ministère de l'Éducation qui va s'associer donc encore une fois à JEPAL, Europe et Pratam, ainsi que la Fondation Jacob à travers le programme Transformer l'éducation dans les communautés de cacao, TREC, pour adapter et piloter ce qu'on appelle aujourd'hui le PEC, le programme d'enseignement ciblé. C'est également important de dire que c'est le premier programme de Teaching at the Right Level qui est lancé en français. Donc, au fur et à mesure des demandes, une organisation est née et c'est donc TARL Africa qui aujourd'hui soutient plusieurs partenaires qui luttent contre la crise de l'apprentissage dans les écoles primaires d'Afrique subsaharienne. Et l'idée, c'est qu'il est important d'adapter cette approche à chaque contexte. Donc, on ne va pas juste prendre l'approche et la mettre dans différents contextes. Il faut aussi un travail d'adaptation. Voilà. Prochain slide, s'il vous plaît. Parfait. Donc, aujourd'hui, le soutien de TARL Africa en 2022, il va s'étendre à plusieurs pays. Tout d'abord, justement, on parle de mise à échelle et on va se rendre compte d'une chose, c'est que dans les pays où on parle de mise à échelle, généralement, TARL Africa va apporter son soutien technique au gouvernement. Donc, comme c'est le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire, de la Zambie ou du Nigeria. Dans certains contextes, TARL Africa va également soutenir des ONG, ça peut être le cas au Mozambique, au Kenya, en Ouganda ou en Sierra Leone, ou encore des acteurs locaux qui veulent mettre en œuvre le PEC, donc comme c'est le cas au Ghana, au Botswana, à Madagascar ou au Niger. Voilà. Prochain slide, s'il vous plaît. Donc maintenant, je vais vous parler du programme d'enseignement ciblé, donc, qui est l'adaptation de l'approche TARL au contexte ivoirien. Donc, en Côte d'Ivoire, l'approche TARL va s'adresser donc à des enfants du niveau CE1, CE2, CM1 et CM2. Et donc, le programme va se faire en français pendant 1h30 par jour et le programme est intégré dans l'emploi du temps existant. C'est-à-dire qu'en Côte d'Ivoire, on ne va pas faire le PEC hors des heures de cours, mais pendant les heures de cours. Et c'est quelque chose d'important quand on veut intégrer ce type de programme et les mettre à échelle.
Il faut vraiment que ça rentre dans les systèmes existants. Ensuite, les facilitateurs sont les enseignants donc existants, ceux qui sont recrutés par le ministère de l'Éducation. Et je parlais plutôt des mentors de proximité qui s'assurent un peu d'un suivi après la formation initiale. Après leur formation au PEC, les enseignants vont être suivis par des mentors de proximité qui ne sont autres que les directeurs d'école et les conseillers pédagogiques qui vont superviser donc leur secteur. Et aujourd'hui, le PEC est mis en œuvre par le ministère de l'Éducation. Donc, c'est important. C'est le ministère de l'Éducation qui met le PEC en œuvre et Tarl Africa apporte son appui technique au ministère. Donc, aujourd'hui, le PEC existe au sein du MENA. Donc, on est parti d'un pilote où on était un peu justement dans ce scénario idéal. L'idée, c'était de voir si le PEC fonctionnait bien en Côte d'Ivoire. Et on s'est rendu compte qu'il y avait de très bons résultats. Donc, l'idée a été de passer tout d'abord à une phase d'extension de 200 écoles. Et à la fin du pilote, tout de suite, après les résultats, le ministère a décidé que ce programme-là serait mis à échelle. Donc, l'objectif, ce n'était plus de prouver que le PEC donnait de bons résultats. Ça avait déjà été le cas pendant le pilote. Le défi, c'était de pouvoir intégrer toutes les composantes finalement de ce programme dans les mécanismes existants du ministère. Voilà. Donc, ce qui s'est passé, c'est que le 17 décembre 2019, il y a eu un protocole d'entente avec le ministère et ensuite un arrêté qui a été signé 2 mois plus tard, en février, et qui définissait un petit peu un cadre de mise en œuvre, c'est-à-dire avec une structure des organes, des rôles et des responsabilités. On avait donc un comité de pilotage qui est, on va dire, l'organe stratégique et aussi en charge de développement de politique. Ensuite, on va avoir donc la coordination nationale qui va être l'organe beaucoup plus opérationnel, qui va s'assurer de l'exécution, de la coordination, du suivi du programme sur le terrain. Et cette coordination va être appuyée par une équipe régionale qui va pouvoir suivre de plus près les activités sur le terrain. Ensuite, il y a un groupe consultatif qui est censé promouvoir donc la coordination des interventions PEC en Côte d'Ivoire ou alors des interventions similaires. Pourquoi ne pas échanger sur les bonnes pratiques? Prochain slide. Voilà. Donc, comme je vous l'ai expliqué, en Côte d'Ivoire, on a commencé par un pilote. Donc, je vais vous donner un petit peu plus en détail les étapes qui nous ont mené aujourd'hui à une mise à échelle à 1000 écoles. Tout a commencé en novembre 2017. Donc, en soi, face au problème de la crise de l'éducation en Côte d'Ivoire, le ministère donc, et la Jacobs Foundation ont sélectionné quelques programmes et sont allés donc voir un peu la mise en œuvre de ces programmes dont l'approche Tarl faisait partie. Donc, on a des personnes du ministère, des agents du ministère qui sont allés en Inde pour voir un peu comment l'approche était mise en œuvre sur le terrain. Suite à ça, le ministère ayant apprécié ce qu'ils avaient vu et pensant que le PEC correspondait à ce dont la Côte d'Ivoire avait besoin, il y a eu donc la conception du programme, toute l'adaptation du programme, du pilote. Donc, ça a été un travail collaboratif, encore une fois, entre l'initiative TREC, le ministère de l'Éducation et JPAL Europe et Pratam, qui est ensuite devenu Tarl Africa. Ensuite, il y a eu le lancement du pilote, la conception donc du matériel. Il fallait adapter le matériel non pas seulement au contexte francophone, mais plutôt au contexte ivoirien, que les enfants puissent lire des textes avec des noms qui leur soient familiers, avec un contexte familier. Ensuite, il y a eu donc la formation des enseignants, puis les activités dans 50 écoles. À la fin du pilote, on a eu donc une réunion de revue. Encore une fois, c'est d'apprendre de ce qui s'est passé, des défis, de ce qui s'est bien passé, afin de réadapter le programme pour la phase d'extension à 200 écoles. On a eu une phase d'extension à 200 écoles, puis suite aux résultats de cette phase d'extension, on a eu donc un engagement pour aller à échelle et là, on est passé à 1000 écoles. Donc, encore une fois, on avait ce challenge de pouvoir intégrer davantage le PEC dans les systèmes existants et c'est ce qui est en train de se faire jusqu'à présent. Pour l'instant, on est encore à 1000 écoles, même si l'objectif est d'aller plus loin. Et ce travail d'adaptation est continu. Chaque année, il y a une revue pour voir comment est-ce qu'on peut mieux adapter le programme. Suivant. Slide suivant, s'il vous plaît. Merci. Donc, voilà. Donc, comme je le disais, on est passé de 50 à aujourd'hui quasiment 1000 écoles. Et en termes de nombre d'enfants, on voit la différence. C'est passé de 5000 écoles à 143 996 enfants. Et l'objectif d'ici à 2025, c'est d'atteindre 5000 écoles, soit presque 1 million d'enfants. Donc, encore une fois, ça va demander un travail d'adaptation, mais c'est ce vers quoi nous allons. Slide suivant, s'il vous plaît. Voilà. Donc, juste pour vous donner aussi une idée de justement un peu cette contextualisation, mais aussi du fait de partir d'un pilote pour aller à échelle, je vais vous montrer les résultats du pilote et aussi les résultats après une première mise à échelle. Donc, quand on regarde les résultats du pilote, on va voir que la proportion des enfants qui sont au niveau paragraphe histoire, donc ce sont les enfants qui savent à peu près lire un paragraphe. On va voir qu'au début, on est à peu près 13% d'enfants qui savent lire au moins un paragraphe et à la fin du pilote, on est à peu près 51% d'enfants. Donc, on a quand même une progression très fulgurante. Et pareil, donc quand on va prendre par exemple le niveau soustraction, on a 12% d'enfants au début contre 63% à la fin. Prenons maintenant le cas après une première mise à échelle. Slide suivant, s'il vous plaît. Voilà. Donc, on voit que quand on regarde les résultats de 2020-2021, on voit qu'après la phase pilote, on est dans ce processus d'intégration des mécanismes du PEC dans les systèmes et on va passer donc à des résultats différents. On va aller à 17% par exemple d'enfants en début d'année versus 35% d'enfants qui savent reconnaître au moins, qui savent lire au moins un paragraphe en fin d'année. Sur le pilote, on était à 51% d'enfants à la fin. Ensuite, on va voir qu'au niveau de la soustraction, si on prend cet exemple-là, on va être à peu près 32% d'enfants qui savent faire la soustraction, contre 58% d'enfants à la fin. Donc, encore une fois, on a une très belle progression, et ce, même une fois que le programme est intégré dans le système. Après, elle n'est peut-être pas aussi, cette progression, elle n'est peut-être pas aussi fulgurante que pendant le pilote, parce que justement, on sort un petit peu de ce contexte idéal et on intègre tout dans le système. Donc, ça peut également refléter cette intégration-là. Mais la bonne nouvelle, c'est qu'on a quand même une belle progression. Donc, voilà un petit peu pour moi pour aujourd'hui. Merci.
Thank you so much, Marianne. So now we'll turn to all of you. Sorry, just a second. In the English channel, we can hear in French. Okay, I think we're fixed now. We'd like to turn it all to all of you to see if you have questions or comments or reflections, either for Marianne and the team in Côte d'Ivoire, or for Larry about his scaling presentation. So please feel free to put a question in the chat or to raise your hand to ask a question as you prefer. And we already do have one in the chat, Marianne. I'm not sure if you saw. Someone asked that within the framework of a remedial program in Togo, they did an ASER evaluation with Pratham, followed by a catch-up program with the World Bank. And so wanted to know about the difference, if there was a difference with the Pratham working in Côte d'Ivoire.
Alors, je ne sais pas si Deviani est là. Sinon, éventuellement, je peux y répondre.
Yeah. Sure, I can answer. Thank you so much for the question. So I think in Togo, they might have used the publicly available tools to carry out an ASER type assessment. The tools are available online and also now on a resource called the FLN Hub. So it is indeed the same Pratham organization that has developed the ASER type of tools and the teaching at the right level approach. So I'm not sure if that answers your question completely, but just to add that in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, unlike Togo, through TAL Africa, Pratham is deeply involved in providing technical support.
Thank you, Devyani. Johannes, I see your hand is raised. Please feel free to ask a question in whatever language you prefer. Oh, you're still on mute though. We can't hear you.
Sorry. Do you hear me now? Yes,
Yes.
I want to ask Lawrence. It was really very good presentation, but I have two comments or questions. One is, how do we, why do we stress on subtraction, not addition, in scaling up? One. Secondly, on the fuse point, he presented about 5 points on scaling up procedures. On the final, in his presentation, full-fledged scaling up takes 50 years, if I'm not mistaken, 50. Is it visible? Because we have 15 years of development goals at the global level, and maybe 10 years plan at the national level, but in Africa we face also problems of turnover. So is it not frustrating? I want to hear from his voice. Thank you so much.
Molly, you want me to respond?
Yes, please.
Okay, thanks for both questions. First of all, the subtraction question. I think that's the most counterintuitive piece of scaling, because those of us who are developing and testing interventions are usually trying to make them as good as we possibly can. Each time we try to make something better, we usually make it more complicated and more expensive. For example, let's say it was an early childhood development program. All of a sudden we discover that having a second teacher in the classroom makes a big difference. Or we discover that nutrition for the kids makes a big difference. Or we discover that parental education makes a big difference. All of those statements are true, they're factually true. Each time we add one of those things, we probably improve the impact of the program. But it's also true that each time we add one of those things, we make it more complicated, more expensive, and more difficult to scale. So the balance throughout is trying to figure out what we can do and what we can deliver at scale and which elements make the biggest difference. So it's the difference between developing the most effective solution you can, or developing an effective solution that also has the potential to scale. And I would say it's not only the most counterintuitive, in some ways it's the most painful part of scaling, because it means taking away sometimes things that we know would make it even better. But the perfect is sometimes the enemy of the good in this. So that's on the first point. On the second point about timeframes, the truth is bad enough. The truth is 15, not 50 on this. But 15, your question, I think, Johannes, is still correct, which is that's much longer than the timeframes that most people have. So a big challenge in scaling is being able to make and show significant progress along the way. So you're not saying, wait, the solution is coming. Sometimes that is rolling it out sequentially. So first it's 20% and then 40% and then 60%. Sometimes it's rolling it out functionally, component 1, component 2, component 3. But in each case, it's a political strategy as well as a technical strategy. How do we maintain commitment over a long period of time and not change direction when a government changes or when some new fad comes into fashion.
Thank you, Larry. Yvonne, was someone else's hand raised that wanted to speak?
Yes, Molly, that is me. So my question is to Marion. As a teacher and an early childhood teacher for that matter, I'm wondering how the program works, because they do engage learners per level, and I'm wondering, how do you do it? Sometimes you find that very young learners are way higher in the level of learning, and some very old learners are also at a very low level of learning. And I did some mentorship in schools, and I encountered this problem where you find that when teachers try to put learners of the same level together, you find very old learners and very young learners. And now that again poses a problem, because there's also the emotional side of learning. So you find that the very old learners will now become even more withdrawn, and sometimes not even learn much, because to them it's a shame. They're grouped with very young learners. And again, even young learners become intimidated. Now they are with these very big people, and they're not able to really air out their views and talk freely and learn. So how is TAL dealing with this? I'm really interested to know that. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Yvonne, pour cette question. Je vais laisser la parole à Madame Madeleine Adaillé, qui est la coordinatrice nationale du PEC en Côte d'Ivoire et qui a également donc été enseignante. Donc, Madeleine, si tu es avec nous, est-ce que tu souhaites répondre à la question de Madame Yvonne? Je vois que Madeleine, est-ce que tu es connectée? Parfait, donc je n'ai pas de réponse de Madeleine pour l'instant. Donc, en effet, donc, ce qui se passe, c'est que on observe dans des classes que des enfants ont des niveaux différents. Cependant, il n'y a pas réellement eu de problème lié au fait qu'il y ait une grande différence d'âge, parce qu'on se rend compte que les enfants, la majorité des enfants finalement sont au niveau débutant. Donc, ce n'est pas qu'il y a une minorité d'enfants d'âge élevé qui est en niveau débutant. C'est que la majorité des enfants finalement vont se retrouver dans ces groupes-là. Donc, ils ne sont pas forcément mal à l'aise de l'être avec des enfants plus jeunes. On a vraiment de gros groupes.
Thank you, Marianne. So we have two questions in the chat, also for you. They're written in French if you want to look at them there, but I can also repeat them for the audience. So the first question is, after the assessments, once the learning difficulties are identified and categorized, is there a remedial device with appropriate exercises for each difficulty that's identified? And the second question is whether there is a tool for monitoring the progress of each student, and are parents involved in monitoring and supporting at home?
Alors, je reprends les questions du chat. J'ai essayé de joindre Madeleine en attendant, mais en attendant, je répondrai donc à sa place. Donc, sur la première question, donc, par rapport donc, à comment s'est fait le choix donc, des écoles pilotes, le choix donc s'est fait dans des régions, dans des zones de cacao. Et ça s'est fait donc dans 2 zones différentes, mais de la même région. En soi, l'idée, quand on met à échelle, dans notre modèle, en tout cas en Côte d'Ivoire, ce n'était pas forcément d'aller tester le programme dans différentes régions, mais déjà de savoir quel allait être l'effet si on arrivait à mettre le programme dans toute une région. Mettre le programme dans 50 régions d'une école, c'est une chose. Le mettre dans toutes les écoles représente un autre challenge, mais c'est également aussi l'opportunité pour nous de voir comment il s'intègre dans le système. Donc, plutôt que d'aller mettre 50 écoles dans plusieurs régions, on a d'abord voulu voir comment est-ce qu'on arrivait à gérer une région entière. Voilà. Ensuite, alors, je regarde les autres questions. Si Madeleine aussi m'entend, elle peut également prendre la parole. Donc ensuite, après les tests, évaluations, une fois que les difficultés d'apprentissage. Oui, alors en effet, bien sûr, une fois que les tests et les évaluations sont faites, les enfants vont être regroupés selon leur niveau et le dispositif d'apprentissage accéléré va se mettre en place. C'est-à-dire que chaque niveau va avoir des activités qui sont adaptées à ce niveau, mais aussi des activités progressives. C'est-à-dire que ces activités vont permettre à l'enfant d'aller au niveau supérieur. Et donc oui, l'outil de suivi de progrès de chaque élève et pour le niveau, donc généralement, c'est le test ASER. On en a un peu parlé au début. Donc, c'est cette évaluation qui va être faite en début, en milieu et en fin d'année et qui va permettre à l'enseignant de voir le progrès de l'enfant et de le faire passer d'un groupe à l'autre. Il y a aussi la possibilité que l'enseignant qui connaît déjà l'enfant puisse se rendre compte de sa progression plutôt que de le maintenir dans un groupe où il a déjà atteint le niveau requis. Il peut le faire passer. L'évaluation ne fera que confirmer sa progression. Voilà. Et au niveau donc du soutien de l'apprentissage à la maison, alors pour l'instant, on n'a pas forcément eu l'opportunité de voir s'il y avait un soutien à l'apprentissage à la maison. Cependant, Tarl Africa est en train de mettre en œuvre donc, ce qu'on appelle des learning labs, des petits laboratoires d'apprentissage où on met en œuvre donc, une approche communautaire qui est censée faire en sorte que les enfants puissent continuer l'apprentissage hors de l'école. Donc, cela pourrait justement pallier à, par exemple, une pandémie ou également pendant les vacances scolaires qui parfois sont très longues et qui causent des pertes d'apprentissage. Donc, c'est encore en expérimentation pour le moment, mais l'idée, c'est que si c'est quelque chose qui fonctionne bien, c'est également d'en faire profiter donc, le reste des écoles concernées par le PEC et si possible même à échelle. Alors, je regarde s'il y a d'autres questions dans le chat.
I think that Isa has their hand raised and would like to ask a question. Isa, can we turn it to you?
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. J'ai déjà posé la question dans le chat puisque j'ai suivi avec intérêt le système de mentorat que nous avons essayé ici dans notre pays, que nous sommes en train d'essayer. J'ai voulu savoir comment cela est fait. Donc, c'est en diade ou bien comment, quand le nombre d'élèves en difficulté est élevé, comment ça se passe exactement. On a bien voulu comprendre davantage.
Alors, c'est une très, très bonne question. C'est vrai qu'en Côte d'Ivoire, comme dans beaucoup d'autres pays, je pense que sur le canal français, on a la traduction anglaise. Donc, voilà, donc je disais que c'était une très bonne question dans le sens où en Côte d'Ivoire, comme dans beaucoup de pays d'Afrique francophone, on a des effectifs pléthoriques dans les classes et c'est vrai que ça peut être un challenge pour l'enseignant, d'autant plus qu'on se rend compte souvent en début d'année que la plupart des enfants sont au niveau débutant. Donc, l'idée, c'est de pouvoir faire une répartition. Si on a 3/4 des enfants qui sont en niveau débutant et 1/4 au niveau, par exemple, mots et paragraphes et histoire, ce qu'on va faire, c'est qu'on va mettre le plus d'enseignants possible sur les élèves de débutants. Donc, par exemple, si on a 3 enseignants, 2 enseignants vont prendre le groupe débutant et on va avoir un autre enseignant qui va prendre les 2 groupes, donc, par exemple, mots, paragraphes et histoire ensemble. On a aussi justement le regroupement dans la classe qui est important quand on a beaucoup d'élèves, c'est-à-dire que en grand groupe, c'est pour la démonstration, mais l'idée de pouvoir faire travailler les enfants en petits groupes, c'est également une façon de mieux gérer ces effectifs-là, c'est-à-dire que des enfants vont pouvoir travailler ensemble entre pairs et l'enseignant va jouer un peu un rôle de facilitateur entre ces groupes, de voir si chaque groupe a compris. Et ça peut aussi être une stratégie pour gérer ces grands groupes-là. J'espère que je réponds à votre question.
Thank you so much. I think that is all of the questions. I'm sorry, I'm sure I could keep asking many more, and thank you both for being willing to respond to them. I have a few other things we're hoping to touch on today. So for now, I think we'll wrap it up, but we will have time to continue discussing in small groups as well as over the next few days. But also, feel free to share more questions in the chat, and we can round up the answers as well and share them with everyone. So I'm very briefly going to introduce a tool that is helpful for this type of scaling. I promise I'll try and take just 5 minutes, and then we'll break up into small groups to discuss this tool, but also continue talking about these topics further. So as I mentioned, I'll be sharing something called the Institutionalization Tracker, which is a tool that we at Brookings developed to help assess the progress of this type of scaling institutionalization. So please feel free to go to the next slide. So through our ongoing scaling research, we at Brookings found that there was a real need for resources that could help support this type of scaling, and there was a gap in the education field, although there are similar tools that exist in health. And so the purpose of this tool that I'm sharing with you today is to track efforts to institutionalize an initiative, integrate it into a formal education system. But it's not meant to just be a type of documentation. It's really intended to be a dynamic planning tool to help implementers, policymakers, and funders to identify areas that require additional effort in the scaling process and inform plans to address these gaps that have been identified. So please go to the next. Really quickly on how we developed this, we based this tool on an existing tool that was used for health and adapted it for the education sector. We gathered feedback from a wide variety of education stakeholders, including the authors of the health tool. We also piloted the tool with partners in multiple countries, including some in Côte d'Ivoire who are present here today, and continue to revise it based on everyone's feedback. We published a first version last July, but our hope is really to continue to gather input and feedback and refine it over time based on people's expertise and experience. So certainly we welcome any input you have on this tool and how we could make it better. Next. So a quick overview before we dive into the specifics. We recommend filling out this tool through a discussion between a group of key stakeholders engaged in scaling who have the ability to act on the tool's findings, make decisions. Often, this is a small group of individuals, maybe from the implementing organization, but it really depends on the circumstances. It could be representatives from the government ministry or department that is leading the scaling or that is initiating a policy change, could include representatives from the organization who's funding the work, or as Larry mentioned, an intermediary, a third party who's helping the process. Ideally, we'd want this same group to use this tool at regular intervals, maybe every 6 months, to see how progress is going and determine actions to strengthen efforts. But if this approach isn't feasible, the tool can also be drafted by one person and then shared with a broader group for discussion. So there's 5 steps, and I'll dive into each one in a moment. But first, we identify assumptions. Then we work through the tool and assign a score for each element. We analyze and display the results and use that to determine priority actions. And then we repeat at regular intervals to assess progress and determine next steps. Next, please. A few last notes. The way this tool is written, it currently measures the progress of efforts related to a single government agency. Right now, it's written for the Ministry of Education, but it could be used for a different ministry if that's more appropriate. We just need to specify that in the beginning. Similarly, it's written to track progress at a national level, but if you're working in a decentralized system or focusing on regional scaling, it can be used at a subnational level as well. And then, notably, the tool is not meant to determine if something should scale. It's not meant to assess the strength of the system. And it doesn't track other important aspects of scaling like quality and impact. And so we would ideally want it to be complemented with other metrics. And in particular, we would suggest using it to inform the creation and the refinement of a broader scaling strategy. And lastly, I'll say the exact score is not the most important, exactly what number you choose. It's really just meant to be a reflection and a tool to spur action. So let's quickly dive into the tool itself. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the first step, the people who are filling out the tool, the group of stakeholders, should specify their assumptions. And this is a way to tailor the more generic tool to the specifics of their context and initiative. So each time they use this tool, the stakeholders come back to these assumptions to update them if need be, make sure they're still true. So this includes a lot of what Larry mentioned, specifying exactly what we're scaling. Is it certain elements of the initiative? Is it exactly as piloted? It also is clearly laying out what the ultimate goal is for institutionalization. So everybody's on the same page when we're selecting a score. And again, as I mentioned, you're clearly spelling out what is the target ministry, what level are we focusing on. Step 2, the next slide, is really the bulk of the tool, which is a rubric. And as you can see, just a second, the tool is organized by education system building blocks, each of which is broken down into specific elements. For each element, there is a set of criteria to consider when you're assigning a score, and then a column for providing an explanation. So the score is based on a scale of 1 to 4. 1 means low institutionalization, 4 means full. And it's important to keep in mind here the amount of progress required to move from a 3 to a 4 is a lot greater typically than a 1 to a 2. So for each element, the group agrees on the current stage and then includes a few sentences in the final column detailing why this score was selected. Some rows might need to be slightly adapted to better suit the realities of the context and the initiative. It's possible a few elements might not be relevant depending on the context, so it's okay to strike those out. And then as you're filling this out, if the current level is below a 1, just select 1 and explain why that was chosen. So here you can see an overview of the tool's different system building blocks and elements. I didn't include the text for each score because it just doesn't fit, but you can see the building blocks are governance, human resources, curriculum, materials, finance, information, demand, equity, inclusion. Each is further broken down and subdivided. And in the upcoming sessions over the next few weeks, we'll dive into a few of these in greater depth. Really quickly, to make this more tangible, I can share one example from the case of PEC, if they were filling out this tool, how they might fill it out. But as I mentioned, we'll break into groups to think about this in your own initiative and work and context, which I think helps, again, make it more concrete. So as you can see, if we were PEC filling out the human resources line, for example, it's looking at the element of personnel. So our government teachers delivering the initiative. And this goes from low, that only discussions have started on this, to full, where teachers are delivering it. It's part of their job descriptions and recruitment strategies. And in the case of PEC, we might choose significant institutionalization, a 3, because PEC is currently being delivered, as Marianne said, by government teachers in public school classrooms during class time, but there is a small amount of ongoing support from the originating institution. Maya, let's just skip to the next slide, if that's okay. So once we've worked through this rubric, we've input a lot of information. So one way to take a look at that information at a glance is to display the results like this. It's called a radar chart or a spider graph. You can see that by visually displaying the results, it's easy to identify where there's been a lot of progress and where maybe progress is stalling. And if the tool is completed a few times, we can put all of the results on the graph and see where we've made progress between sessions. Next. So as we all know, time, capacity are limited. We can't prioritize working on every element all at once. And so the final step of using this tool is for the stakeholders to review the results and determine a small number of priority areas that they can focus on to further the process toward institutionalization. The goal isn't to try and get a 4 on everything, but rather to identify a few priorities, strategize how to make progress towards them, and outline concrete and feasible actions that can be undertaken in the next 6 to 12 months to make progress. And these key actions and next steps, ideally, like I mentioned, would feed into a broader scaling strategy for the initiative.
Sure. Thank you, Molly, and to all the presenters. So for this final part, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but we'd love to practice using this tool in some small groups and reflect on questions and learnings from today's presentations that resonate with your own experience scaling education initiatives. So we are going to break into small discussion groups for the next 15-20 minutes. Each group is organized by language, and there will be 3 to 4 countries per group. Feel free to talk in the language that is most comfortable for you. There will be one group that will stay in the main room and use interpretation so that everybody can communicate together. And there's a facilitator for each group who will help guide you through some general discussion questions. Today is just an opportunity to meet each other, share some experiences from your own context, and think about how you could apply the tool Molly just shared for some examples from your own work. And then you're going to meet with this same group over the next 2 sessions as well. So it'll be a nice community of people to continue learning from. We'll start next session with these same groups. So today is just a chance to get to know each other, start working, and then we'll pick this up again next time, next Wednesday. For the breakout rooms, we will have an option pop up on your screen in a moment with this small tile, and you can choose your room. I'll show you where the countries are, and you can pick the number that aligns with your country. You can sort yourself, so we won't move you. It will be up to you to pick the room that matches your country. If you have any problems or questions, though, please feel free to ask, and we're happy to help you move to the correct room. So we have some broad groups here, and we know these are imperfect. Not everybody may be here. Some people are not here today and maybe in the future, but for now we're planning to have 6 groups. 5 will be in breakout rooms. If you are in group number 6, please stay in this main room so that you can continue to use the interpretation. Before I open up the rooms, I want to pause to see if there are any questions. If not, I'll open the rooms, and just to know, I'm also going to put in the chat the discussion questions today. As I said, it's just a chance to introduce yourselves and talk about your own experiences with scaling education innovations. These are going to be in the chat here. All right. Oh, apologies, I'll put those in the chat. And we will open up the rooms now, and this will stay on the screen so you can see which is the correct group to join. All right, and apologies while I just open up the rooms here. Right, so rooms are open. Please feel free to join the room that matches the country you are joining us from. And if you have any questions, please let us know.
Hello, I'm Ruben from Malawi.
From Malawi?
Yes, I'm a Chief Education Officer, Secondary Directorate.
Welcome, we're glad you're here. It looks like Malawi is group 3, so I'll move you to that room.
Thank you.
Can I help
Hi,
anyone
Molly.
else move? Yes.
Yeah, I'm Beza with still getting the button, selecting the button. Group 2.
Group 2, okay.
Yeah.
Maya,
Yes.
Maya, peux-tu me transférer dans le groupe francophone, please? Avec Adrien Makaya et Mathieu Lang.
Oui. Maimouna, can you
Oui,
stay here?
Maimouna, je
Group
pense qu'on peut
6
tous aller
is
dans le
here.
groupe 5.
Comment?
Il n'y a pas de groupe 6, hein. Le groupe 5.
Ah, alors, attends, le groupe francophone, c'est lequel je me retrouve pas? Groupe 6.
So if you are group 6, please stay here because we will make sure we have French and Portuguese interpretation for the discussion. Okay, is there anyone else I can help move rooms?
Donc, normalement,
Oui.
Ok.
Le groupe 6 reste dans la salle. Là.
Ok. Thank you.
Du coup, M. Makaya va aller dans le groupe 5.
Ils sont combien dans le groupe 5? C'est pour mieux repartir, en fait. C'est un groupe francophone aussi?
Oui. And also Portuguese. If you are here still, we're going to assume you're in group 6. So please feel free to start. And for group 6.
Je pense qu'ils sont 8.
Ils sont 8. Et ici, on est 35.
35, yes.
Yes, on peut essayer d'équilibrer, maybe.
Il y a le groupe 4 aussi. Hein, il y a le groupe 4 qui est le groupe de M. Lang.
Okay, next time. And continue talking about this same question of how does this talk of institutionalization and scaling relate to your own work, and how can this tool or other things we talk about in these sessions support your own work and learning from each other. So before we finish today, we would love your feedback on anything that happened in this session. We have a very short survey that I'll put a link to in the chat. And then I'm just going to briefly introduce kind of what will take place in the next session, which will take place at the same time next Wednesday, June 8th. Between now and next session, if you have time, please feel free to try out the tool and see if you can apply it to an example from your own context. Listening in the different rooms, I heard so many interesting examples of different innovations that are being scaled. And it would be really interesting to see how you use this tool and where you score the different elements of scaling based on these different examples that were being shared. Next session will be focused specifically on the Côte d'Ivoire case and innovative partnerships and funding. This was already briefly introduced today, but we'll have a much greater discussion about all the different stakeholders who were involved in helping to scale up PEC, from the public sector, the private sector, research, implementation, and how all these actors come together. We will share an email with today's recordings in French and Portuguese and English, as well as the presentations in all 3 languages and the tool. And if you have any questions about any of these, please feel free to reach out before next session. And we look forward to seeing you next week. I'll turn it back over to Molly. Thank you so much.
No, that's everything. Just thank you all for joining us. Please, as Maya said, feel free to reach out with any questions. We hope you'll have a chance to briefly fill out the survey so we can make next week's session even better. And we look forward to seeing you next week. And yes, absolutely, we will share the French version of the tool with you all right after this, as well as the slides. Thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of your day or evening.
I see.
Thank you.
It looks like there might be a challenge with the survey. The link is not working.
Thank you. I'll just try to fix it.
Yeah.
I'll give it right now. And if not, we'll send it in the email as well. And we welcome your feedback that way.
Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
See you next Wednesday.
Thank you, everybody. Merci à tous.
Thank you, everybody. Just that my connection went off, but I'm back once more. Thank you.
Madame Ayumuna, on n'a pas eu le temps de débuter, hein, mais on nous a vite coupé. Hein. Et donc, on doit réfléchir à posteriori. Hein, et donc, on poursuit là et on échange et tout cela. Quoi.
On va poursuivre la discussion pour adapter, en fait. Ouais, le temps était court. Le temps était très court.
Mais moi, je pense qu'en prenant l'exemple de la Côte d'Ivoire,